All right, we have Ryan Bush on the podcast. He is a designer, thinker, and author. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and discuss some of these ideas with you.
Sweet. So is your first book Designing the Mind, or did you write something before that?
Now, that was my first book, really first like public writing of any kind,
Okay.
which is kind of hard to believe now. That was in 2021. And since then, yeah, I've written a couple other books of various lengths, a couple online programs, and kind of built a whole community around it. But the first book was Designing the Mind, The Principles of Psychotecture.
And what is psychotecture?
Yeah, so this is a term I coined in the book to sort of refer to the process of changing and designing your mind. I felt like there was kind of a missing term here for what this process actually was that a lot of these philosophers have been doing for thousands of years, and that each of us kind of has the ability to do ourselves, to go in and change the psychological habits, the kind of intertwined emotional reactions and beliefs and behaviors. And so I draw from a lot of ancient thinkers, some modern psychologists, and kind of put together this whole discipline of crafting our own psychological software.
And you mentioned in your new book, Becoming Who You Are, which when are you going to release that? Do you know?
Become Who You Are. It comes out
Sorry.
early next year, no problem. And yeah, it should be available for pre-order any day now at this point. So, but probably late February-ish for the official release.
So you started kind of in the introduction, you kind of mentioned how you started thinking about these things from a very early age. Can you kind of brush onto how you got involved in psychology, how you got involved in philosophy, kind of what brought you down that path?
Yeah, I remember from a very early age just generally being very curious about the big questions in life, and also my own mind. So I was I remember like stumbling across a lot of philosophical concepts that I would later learn the term for, just kind of in my own reflections, and coming up with a lot of ideas about what's going on in my own mind and how we change our own minds, how we, influence our own emotions. And, thinking I had a lot of original ideas, and then eventually exploring a lot of these other thinkers and realizing they all beat me to it by 2,000 years.
Dude, that's
Uh,
always the worst. Like you're reading some Nietzsche, and it's like, oh, I thought of that before, but that's also that's the reason why
right.
Nietzsche like resonates with so many people, right? It's like you read it, and he touches on so many things that we think about, but in
Yeah,
a
well,
way that really resonates.
he was so ahead of his time in that
Yep.
sense. A lot of the stuff is obvious to us now because we have, modern neuroscience and stuff. But when I
Yep.
read Nietzsche, I'm like, how did he intuit all this at such a, hundreds of years ago, basically?
Yeah, and then it's also so many thinkers have been inspired by Nietzsche. So, you'll be
Oh,
reading
yeah.
Freud or Jung, and then you kind of touch on, and then if you go back to Nietzsche, you're like, oh yeah, these guys were inspired by him. Um,
Yeah. And I connect him to Maslow too. There's so much connection between Nietzsche's self becoming and Maslow's self actualization, right?
so I haven't really read any Maslow. I've kind of brushed on him as far as what his like five like going towards self-actualization, the like five needs or whatever. Could
Yeah.
you kind of brush on Maslow and kind of what you've pulled from him in your writings?
Yeah. Great question. He's my all-time favorite psychological thinker. Assuming we create this distinction between like Nietzsche is a philosopher and Maslow is a
Yep.
psychologist, really, I think they were kind of the same thing, and we just categorize them differently. Nietzsche is known, Maslow is known as the like pyramid of self-actualization guy. But really, he never drew that pyramid, and he never quite laid it out the same way that others have in characterizing him. Really, his concept of self actualization was this incredibly rich vision of human health. And he's his writing just pulls you in if you read like toward a psychology of being or the farther reaches of human nature. But essentially what he's arguing is that there is a core of psychological health within each of us. You could think of it like an acorn of values that has the sort of DNA to become an oak tree. And he made this comparison. Nietzsche, I believe, has made this comparison too. This idea that we have values in us that sort of provide a blueprint for who we are to become, and that we can find evidence of this through our evaluative impulses about the world. And Maslow basically said, not enough people are becoming who they are capable of becoming. Not enough people are able to pursue this path toward this sort of ideal state of both, happiness and altruism and the maximization of their potential. And why is that? And so he sort of created this field that, has sort of become positive psychology, but actually focusing on creating the conditions to cultivate deep human well-being instead of just focusing on curing illness and ailments.
So then that kind of brings us to your books, Designing the Mind and Become Who You Are, right? You're trying to lay out a way in which you can reach that self-actualization. You can say become who you are by designing your mind.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So can you kind of explain like what the main kind of topics of Become Who You Are is, or like if you want, spoiler alert, right? But just to get
Absolutely.
people interested in your book.
Yeah. So what I'm doing in this book is sort of weaving together quite a few different disciplines and schools of thought. You could come at it from a philosophy, virtue ethics angle. You could come at it from a psychology of happiness and depression angle. And I also come at it from a personal experiences and, kind of a personal angle too. But yeah, essentially this is it's called virtue self-signaling theory, is the sort of overarching theory that I present through this book. And I provide a lot of support from a lot of different areas, but I start out with this very intuitive sort of concept that you can think about how we navigate our happiness in life as being like a chessboard in front of us. So if you imagine there's a chessboard in front of you on the table, there's an x-axis and a y-axis, right? The x-axis represents pleasure and pain. So if you move further to the right, you get more pleasure. The left is pain. Same goes for the y-axis, but this is loss and gain. So this is, more of a long-term consideration. We sometimes sacrifice our pleasure in the moment in order to achieve more long-term gain. And so the argument is that we all kind of naturally navigate life through a map kind of like this. And the problem with that is that it very often doesn't deliver in the way we expect. It's like navigating with a map of the wrong place and constantly stumbling and saying, why am I ending up here? I thought I was supposed to be there. So we win the lottery, and when we study lottery winners, we find they're not really any happier than they were before. We have some big loss happen to us, and we end up saying a few weeks later it's the best thing that ever happened to us. So why are we using this map if it doesn't really correspond to our deeper happiness? Well, this is a common thread of all these philosophical thinkers, from Socrates and the Stoics to Nietzsche to Maslow and more contemporary thinkers. It's basically what we think makes us happy doesn't really make us happy, and we need to go deeper to understand what does. And so to demonstrate this, I kind of argue you can imagine taking this chessboard and pulling mountains and valleys out of it so it becomes a three-dimensional topography, essentially. And saying when we think that what's making us happy in our lives is these things that we're actually encountering or gaining in our lives, we're actually mistaken. It's really when we're moving up in this z-axis, climbing higher on these mountains or lower in the valleys, that actually corresponds to our well-being. So what is this z-axis? Well, there are a lot of terms you could use for it. I sort of start out by saying it's admirability. It's the degree to which you admire yourself and you are seeing evidence of the traits or the virtues that you admire in yourself. And now this word virtue has been used kind of throughout philosophy. It's got a pretty rich, long history, but for short, it means something different than I think most of us assume in modern culture. It's not just this preachy kind of moral purity thing. It's a much more colorful kind of way of looking at our greatest strengths and our highest values. And so really, I'm arguing, and I pull in a lot of evolutionary and neurological support for this later in the book, but essentially there is a mechanism in our brain that is really regulating our moods and our deepest sense of well-being according to our own admiration for ourselves and our traits and behaviors.
Now, what do you say when people admire themselves a little bit too much?
Yeah. So if it doesn't actually correspond to reality, if you are admiring traits that don't actually exist, I would say you're trying to trick your brain when your brain is really much smarter than that. And so narcissists are kind of people with inaccurate egos, you could say, people who have tried to trick themselves into thinking that they're better than they really are, but it doesn't really work. And we pretty much find this when you try to artificially inflate someone's self-esteem. They kind of know better, and a part of their brain is never really able to integrate that because they aren't seeing evidence of it through their behaviors.
So what's your opinion on that with, say, like giving out like participation trophies in the modern day?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I don't think there's anything wrong with giving out participation trophies because just participating in many ways demonstrates more virtues than actually being good at it. I mean, is the kid who
Yeah.
shows up and, works hard every day and never gets to actually play in a game, is he not virtuous, right? Well, he probably has just as much, virtue as the other guy, but I think we should acknowledge what those virtues are. We shouldn't tell everyone they're great at basketball if they suck at it. We should tell them they work hard and
Yeah.
they push themselves, and that's a good trait to have too.
Dude, I suck at basketball. I'm
Oh,
terrible.
I'm the worst at basketball. Oh my God.
No, I think I just think too much about like where the ball's going, and then
Oh
it's just
yeah.
like, and at that point, I just miss it.
No, it's funny
But
because I talk about like the importance of bringing together your strengths and like
yep,
rigging the game against you in a sense. And sometimes I talk about a world that's made up of like basketball and small talk as the opposite of that for me. It would just be like rigging the game totally against myself so I'm bad at everything. But in many ways, what we want to do with our lives is the opposite of that.
can you kind of elaborate on that? What do you mean by rigging the game, and why? And why rig the game?
Yeah, so you're never going to be good at everything. This is a kind of
Yep,
a principle of our virtues. We have limited resources and innate abilities, and even though we can get better at things, right, we still have to make choices and compromises about what we want to focus on. So the idea is that we want to design the core domains of our lives so that they really give us an opportunity to bring our greatest strengths out and combine our greatest strengths. And that's kind of what I mean by rigging the game in your favor. It's like, we want to make a life for ourselves where we are able to naturally bring out all these things that we're best at in the same kind of place or through our work and our relationships, communities.
are you familiar with Andrew Huberman?
Yeah, yeah.
He I was listening to one of his podcast episodes about goal setting, and he said that
Mm-hmm.
the most effective way to achieve a goal is to have a limited number of goals,
Oh, yeah. Trying to do
right?
everything is never going to work.
So have you kind of encountered that where you've had to say drop a few things in order to focus on one primary goal and in order to accomplish it?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's really a sweet spot because if you only have one
Yeah.
goal or one virtue or one
Yep.
anything, you're putting all your eggs in one basket. And then, if you fail at that, you're going to be completely crushed, right? If you have too
Yep.
many, you're not going to be able to keep up with it and you're not going to do anything right. So I don't know, somewhere in the 3 to 5 range seems like a healthy range. And I talk about it like talk about your virtue portfolio. Like you can think about it like investing, like you have a limited amount of funds. Where are you going to put it into so as to maximize how much it returns for you?
No, I really like that idea. I really struggle with it because I always like have all these ideas and then I'll want to start one project and then I have all these other projects and I just don't know what to
Yeah.
do. So what's your strategy, I guess, as far as like setting up, say, a hierarchy of goals? What's your strategy for that?
So I think the important thing with goals is first of all, they should be in alignment with your values. So you should really
Okay.
ask the big questions first. And this has multiple benefits. You know, one of them is just that you don't want to pursue a bunch of goals that once you get there, you're going to realize this doesn't actually mean anything to me. This was just sort of society's prescription that I just bought into and wasted my life on. Another is that your goals aren't going to be as motivating if they don't tap into something deeper. And so you're going to be able to push a lot harder. I'm able to be a lot more motivated toward my mission with designing the mind because it means something to me on a deeper level. And if you start a business that is only profitable, for example, and you have no personal connection to it, you're going to get bored of it after a couple months, and that's going to fizzle out. I also think goal setting, just in terms of well-being, is absolutely huge. I think a lot of people think that like once they get to the point that they are trying to reach, if they can make enough money to retire or whatever, or if they get married, once they get there, they'll be done and they won't have to work at it all anymore. And I think the reality is the minute you stop having goals that you're setting and pursuing is the minute you start slipping down into depression and getting bored and feeling bad about yourself, because again, you're not sending your brain that signal of those virtues that you possess. You're letting them sort of lay dormant, and that's a great path to just depression and decay.
So, I kind of wanted to ask you as far as become who you are. How do you become who you are, and how do you find out who you are, I guess?
Yeah, that's a big question. So I think for me, a lot of that happened when I was a kid and I was going on long walks and asking myself a lot of these questions that I was just genuinely curious about. I think most of us today have so many like distractions and temptations that we don't ever really spend enough time with ourselves to gain this self-understanding. I actually developed a deck of introspection cards called Mindsight, with the goal of
Cool.
kind of getting people to ask these questions about themselves. You take a card, you go on a walk, you write down in your little logbook, the answers, and they kind of build on each other and build this sort of tower of self-knowledge. So it starts with asking things like, who are the people in your life that you admire? Who are the historical figures or fictional characters even that you feel the most admiration for? That's very important to take note of, and specifically to write down what are the traits that you admire in all these people. I mean, this is a very Nietzschean approach. He had these ideals. He looked at like Goethe and Beethoven and people, and said like, these are the people I admire and want to take parts of and integrate into myself. And so I think creating a really robust list of the things that you value and the things you admire is one of the first steps to that roadmap. Another one is writing down just what you're naturally good at already, right? Creating a list of your strengths, either by taking like, there's some good online surveys. There's some, you can ask, all your friends and family, and they might surprise you what they tell you you're good at. But trying to find convergence between these things that you admire in others and the things that you're good at yourself, and saying, how can I get a little closer? And I build out a whole kind of hierarchy of this process, because depending on where you are currently in this process, you may be pretty deeply fulfilled but just looking to get higher, or you may be so depressed that you can't even get out of bed most days. And so the process looks a little different. If you're really depressed, what you need to do is, it's called behavioral activation. It's a process where you basically simply set a daily activity schedule and gradually work more activity and action into your daily schedule in baby steps. Like initially you're just saying, I'm just going to get out of bed and shower each day, and then you're saying, okay, well, I've got that down. I'm going to take a shower and clean my room and go on a walk. And as you work your way up, you find ways to integrate more of those virtues into it. So you're saying, I'm going to create art because creativity is one of my strengths. I'm going to call a friend and talk them through some of their struggles because compassion is one of my strengths. And so as you work your way up, you find more and more sort of idiosyncratic ways that are unique to you for bringing out the highest expression of those virtues as you can. And eventually you're designing, new vessels for these strengths. Like I feel like I've done with designing the mind and creating new ways that wouldn't necessarily be possible through a traditional job or things like that, to integrate all these different strengths and passions.
It's kind of like, if you're designing a house, you have to start this with the foundation, right? And then
Yeah,
you kind
yeah,
of keep building yourself up until you get to a point where, you have a finished product.
yeah,
Then maybe you want to
absolutely.
buy a new house after that, but
Right. Who can afford that these days, though?
um so yeah, no, I really like that idea where I've heard this before where yeah, you got to take like baby steps to kind of build yourself up, first start with like say cleaning your room and then, take a shower, maybe go for a walk, maybe and then like at some point go to the gym,
Yeah.
and kind of like build yourself up, get mentally good and then start, setting those bigger goals like, maybe I don't know if you want to become a lawyer, go to school or something.
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah. No, that's a
Um,
good examples of it.
but yeah, I love how you kind of lay out that in a very unique way. I feel like your book really uniquely highlights like how to design your mind, which is why, why you coined that term psychitecture.
Yeah.
And because it's not really quite about um, becoming who you are, it's kind of say taking who you are and becoming who you want to be.
Well, and that's kind of the argument, because Nietzsche used this phrase "become who you are," and it always seems
Yep.
like paradoxical, like you already are who you are.
Yeah.
But the argument is sort of like these evaluations of who you admire and what your ideals are, they're already there in your brain, right? You
Yeah.
haven't integrated them yet, but it's already you in a sense. And so the you that needs to become more is the you in actuality, right? But the you that represents your highest ideals, it's already there in some form. So it's already who you are, but you haven't brought it into actualization yet.
Yeah, and you're going to become whatever you think you are because what you think you are, you're going to act on, right? Like if you think that you're a bad person or if you think that you're if you think that you're lazy, you're going to be a bad person, you're going to be lazy. Whereas if you
Mm-hmm.
kind of change that about the way that you conceptualize yourself, you're going to then become that higher version of yourself.
Yeah, this gets into cognitive restructuring a little more, because if you have distorted beliefs about yourself that
Yep.
don't really map onto reality, then you need to work on those beliefs. And some
Yep.
people, quite frankly, have accurate negative beliefs about themselves, and that's when you need to change your behaviors. But
Yep.
if you really do have these distorted worldviews and views on yourself, that's where you're going in and identifying those beliefs that seem to put you in a bad mood, and saying, what's the error here? What is the distortion? How can I correct this? There's a list of, a dozen most common mental distortions that affect our beliefs about ourselves. So really going into that and saying, where am I distorted? What are my flawed beliefs, and how can I make them more healthy and accurate and balanced?
So where do you think, say, self-forgiveness comes into all this?
Yeah, it's a good
Have you
question.
dived into that at all?
A little bit. I talk about self-compassion and these things, and I
Okay.
think there's kind of a fine line, because some people will take it too far and say, um, first they do the healthy thing and they say, I
Yeah.
accept who I am exactly,
Mhm.
as I am, right? Which you should do as a starting point. But then they say, I don't need to become anything else. I'm perfect as I already am. And I think you don't have to do that. I think you can do both. So first of all, yes, you should accept yourself. You should accept your current emotional state. You should accept the past because you can't change it. You should accept that you've made mistakes and you have strengths and weaknesses,
Yeah.
right? This is all important. But then there's another step, which is that you set your aims to do better in the future. You set realistic incremental aims. You don't expect to change, rapidly overnight. But beating yourself up and blaming yourself for the past really doesn't serve any purpose. So self-forgiveness is a must. And I think that's a part of psychotecture in general, is just looking at what are these useless emotions that are holding me back, and what's the creative solution to work through that emotion. And so I think blame and a lack of self-compassion is one of those things that you do want to work through and then move past.
Well, I was speaking with a therapist of mine about a year ago, and he was telling me how I need to move from taking fault and blame for things to going to taking responsibility for them.
Yeah, definitely an improvement. I mean, and really you should have a realistic view of the responsibility part too. I mean,
Yep.
you don't have control over everything. You
Yep,
definitely shouldn't
exactly.
worry about what you can't control. And you should understand that even moving forward, I have a limited degree of control over even my own actions. I need to work to develop more self-mastery from what I have now. But I also don't have perfect self-mastery and never will. So just need to work on taking a step up in that Z dimension, that mountain of virtue. How can I get one step higher than I am right now?
So, I guess how do you kind of know that you're being virtuous? Like, I mean, we touched on things similar to virtue, but not exactly virtue itself. Like, how would you define virtue and what is virtuous?
Yeah, good question. So my understanding of virtue, and it's probably a little bit different from Nietzsche's or the Stoics or any of these other
Okay.
thinkers, but it's essentially that virtue are these traits that are naturally admired. They naturally elicit admiration in other humans, and I understand them to be generally universal and across
Okay.
cultural. And there's research justifying that as well. But it can be anything from courage to creativity to compassion, right? I mean, any of these traits, any of these things that a person can be good at, and that they're likely to be admired for. This is a virtue. So I think as far as knowing whether you're virtuous or not, what I argue is that evolution has basically gradually designed a system in our brains that makes these evaluations for us, and kind of on an unconscious level. And so your brain knows whether you know or not how virtuous you're being. If you are, taking actions that you would really admire in someone else, you're going to generally have a pretty high level of well-being and vitality, and just a general sense of mental health, right? And you're going to feel proud of yourself on a fairly regular basis. You're going to feel like you admire yourself. And if you're not taking these actions, your brain is likely going to be giving you self-critical rumination, and you're going to feel lethargic and just generally be in a bad mood. And so the best way to teach yourself whether you're virtuous or not is by going out and doing things, taking action and demonstrating it to yourself, and your brain is monitoring that. I argue that this system has its roots in social and sexual selection. In our ancient, tribal times, we essentially all had to make really careful judgments about our, social allies and our mates and things like that. So we evolved a system for monitoring ourselves in the same way that other people would monitor us. And as a result, right, this system puts us in a lower mood if that will bring about behaviors that would be advantageous in this scenario. So when you're depressed, right, you withdraw socially, you develop socially risk-averse behaviors, right? You don't do a whole lot of stuff to put yourself out there on display, where your lack of virtue, or at least lack of ability to bring out those virtues, is on full display and could damage your social status. And when you're in a great mood, right, you want to take those behaviors that will put you on display, will put yourself out there. And I think that's sort of, you could say, by design in terms of our evolutionary wiring. It wants us to be in that mood, so we will take those behaviors.
So what do you think of, say, we've brushed on depression and say, taking small steps until you feel better. How about
Mhm.
social anxiety? Like,
Yeah.
you're invited to a party and then, the party's at 6 o'clock and then you're just thinking all day, oh man, I don't want to go to that party. I'm gonna have to talk to people. They're gonna ask me questions. How do you confront something like that?
Yeah, so I struggled with social anxiety for years. And I actually, one of the things I built since coming out with my first book is a program called the Anxiety Algorithm that provides a really comprehensive, systematic process for overcoming really any kind of anxiety. And it's more or less the process that I followed when I was much younger and dealing with this social struggle and going into school for the first time and feeling like I was on an alien planet, basically. So, but in some ways it overlaps with the ideas in this book. In other ways, it's kind of its own beast, its own system in our
Yeah.
brains. But in general, with anxiety, it very much applies to social anxiety. Um, it's fueled by avoidance, and when we avoid things, either explicitly or through the way we're thinking about them, that reinforces the anxiety, and it tells our brain, this is a real danger, you should continue to be afraid of it. And so
Yeah.
when you get invited to that party and you're worrying about talking to people and you try to talk yourself out of it and you're like, oh, I'm not going to go to the party, or if you do go to the party, being like, oh, I'm just going to hang out away from everyone and pet the dog, or I'm going to uh, create an escape plan for myself so I have an excuse to leave early. Right? These are all forms of escape and avoidance. So you're essentially reinforcing
Mhm.
that fear. So what you want to do, and it's very similar to the behavioral activation thing, is just create a set of exposure, a hierarchy essentially of tasks that if you do them, you will induce a little bit of anxiety. And then when you do those things, right, you want to make sure you stay in the situation, you don't escape it either cognitively or physically, right? You wait until the anxiety subsides naturally, and then you walk away from that experience with slightly less anxiety towards it. And then you can move to that next step and say, what would scare me a little bit more? And as you work your way up from 1 to 10 in terms of the scariest things, that fear naturally will diminish. And this is basically what I did in school when I was a kid. I don't know how I knew this really as a 13-year-old, but I went and did the scariest thing I could think of, which was to join the football team. And I started volunteering to give presentations in school, and I starting conversations with people I didn't know, basically because on some level I knew I needed to expose myself to exactly what was scary to me, get out of my comfort zone, and that would diminish my fear and enable me to become the person I was actually proud of. And so anxiety can definitely be a barrier to this process, that I think we have to sort out in some ways separately, and in some ways it's all very intertwined.
Yeah, and I've noticed that say if I'm really anxious about something, sometimes just like literally talking about it makes me feel
Hmm.
better because it's kind
Yeah,
of like it feels like there's a storm inside of my head, like a fire that needs to just be like released. And I
yeah,
feel like a lot of times when you need to go when you're anxious about something, just going in and doing it makes you feel better.
yes.
Because what you're anxious about is basically all the possible things that could go wrong,
Hmm.
right? But if you're already in it, there's no thinking about any possibilities.
Exactly. That's a great point. And then, another thing to point out is that worry is basically this process of, I mean, it's very closely linked to obsessive compulsive disorder, where you have an obsession, you have the thing you're worried about, and then you have the compulsion that soothes you. So even if you're not washing your hands constantly or checking the oven 20 times, you're still doing a very similar process in your head where you have this worry and then you reassure yourself and you say, no, no, it's not going to be that bad. And then you think about the worst case scenario and then you reassure yourself and say, that's not going to happen. And so you're really not letting yourself consider the possibility. for very long. And that's one of the reasons why talking it out with yourself, actually, letting yourself consider this worst case scenario, often exposes you to it and has the same effect as exposure therapy. It makes it less scary, and you start saying, oh, that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, so what if that happens?
So you're almost saying it's better to think about the worst case scenario, and then in a sense that's confronting it.
Yes, think about it until it's boring to you, until you become desensitized to it. Because worry is kind of like this, like, wannabe bully in your head that's, it's confronting you and it's trying to act tough. But when you actually stand up to it and examine it, it loses its power, essentially. So, yeah, I actually recommend people create worry scheduling appointments. Like, you schedule a worry appointment for Sunday at 2 p.m. every day. And when you start to have worries popping up at other times in the week, you say, no, we have an appointment. Just come back at Sunday at 2. And very often when you get there, your worries don't even show up, and you realize, like, oh, I'm not even really worried about this. And it really works too. Like, this willingness to meet with your worries, invite them in to, sit down and have a chat with you, has this effect of, weakening them and taking the power away from them.
So I kind of wanted to ask you about the default mode network. You
Yeah.
mentioned it in the new book. So I wanted to ask about that because I really liked reading that section. So what is the default mode network?
Yeah, so this is a network in the brain that consists of a few different regions that basically we see lighting up anytime a person is not actively engaged in something else. So if they're just sitting there, you see their default mode network is lit up, and if you ask them to do some demanding task, then other parts of the brain light up. So we have to infer that basically this is the network that is doing something in the background pretty much all the time. And people have tried to figure out what that is. And we find that when we give them self-referential tasks, if we ask them to think about themselves and their strengths or their social standing or, these things, that part of the brain lights up even more. And so essentially we've concluded that there's something very self-oriented, self-referential thinking. Some have even gone so far as to say it's the neurological basis for the self, essentially. And so this is clearly a really important part of the brain. When we look at, meditators who have spent decades trying to transcend their sense of self, we see that their default mode network is much less active. And when people take psychedelics, which are often reported to have like a diminishing or, disrupting effect on our sense of self, it disrupts connectivity in that network as well. Right. So all of this comes together to suggest that the default mode network might essentially be the part of the brain that is analyzing us constantly, a social simulator in a sense. This connects into the evolutionary kind of ideas here, which is, there's a theory called sociometer theory that argues that we're pretty much always examining ourselves according to social outcomes and socially valued traits. And this is why we have self-esteem. This is why we're constantly sort of thinking about ourselves and ruminating, or, maybe we're having positive thoughts about ourselves. But the brain is doing this as a kind of simulator to let us know, how we're showing up in our social world. And so I have gone a step further in this book and argued that this default mode network, this sociometer, this mechanism in our brain that is monitoring us, it's also regulating our moods accordingly. And as a result, this default mode network is likely responsible for analyzing and making the judgments that will change the chemical, breakdown of our brains and potentially make us more depressed or, more fulfilled and vital, according to what it finds. And so there's a lot of people who have argued that you should quiet your default mode network. You should limit your sense of self, transcend your ego completely. And while I think this would be a much better approach than, to remain in a state where you don't approve of yourself and you do have this self-critical monologue, I think it's better than either of those to redesign your ego, to build a better ego that's based in reality and become a person that you do approve of, so that your default mode network likes you instead of hating you.
Yeah. No, this is something that I've thought about before too, and it's like a lot of people say that the goal of meditation is to kind of become nothing,
Yeah.
but I think it's more than that. It's becoming nothing and then becoming something else, right? Like becoming a higher version of yourself
Yeah.
in the process.
I've said like, if you imagine that you're like creating a painting
Yeah.
and you're really up close to the painting so you can't see it clearly,
Yeah.
right? Meditation serves the purpose of allowing you to take a step back and
Yeah.
examine this painting and say, okay, what do I need to do to improve it now that I've got the
Yeah.
distance to observe it? But a lot of
Mhm.
people take meditation to mean take a step back and then keep stepping back until you're on another continent, right? And I don't think you want to completely lose your sense of self. I think you want to be able to examine it from a distance so that you can build a better self.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And for a lot of people, it's hard to take that step back because they're so focused on all the little like micro stuff, the little micro guilts, and I mean, I find myself very like so focused on say like the future and the past that it's really hard to kind of take a step back and focus on what's going on right now.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
that's where I think mindfulness can be really useful.
yeah, and I wanted to brush back on the default mode network and how say this is more or less a lot of this is your internal dialogue, if I'm not mistaken,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
Yeah, and I think it's Truth and Lie in an Extra Moral Sense by Friedrich Nietzsche. It's like a little essay, but he kind of goes into language and how when we think of consciousness and who we are, what we're really thinking about is the thing that thinks inside of us, right? That internal dialogue.
Mm.
And do you think, um, as far as that goes, do you think that's kind of who we are? Like the thing that is the self is that default mode network, and then everything else is kind of like external to that?
I would say that. Yeah, that's what I've sort of concluded. And I need to read that essay if I haven't already. Do you know which like book it's in?
Well, you can read it in if do you have the portable Nietzsche? It's
I
the
don't actually have a print copy, but
Yeah, well, I would just look it up. It's probably available in a PDF, but yeah,
yeah.
it's probably my favorite piece written by Nietzsche, and he really
Wow.
goes into language and how when we're like all languages, like you're kind of lying because you're making unequal things equal. Like for
Mm.
instance,
Yeah,
leaves.
yeah.
All leaves are unequal, but we all sum them up into being leaves,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
No, and that's kind of the core idea of non-duality too. And the map is not the territory, right? Our language inevitably turns, a complex continuum into a bunch of simple categories.
Yeah, and I really like um I feel like we do get lost in the language a lot of the time. And sometimes I've kind of found in work, say like work meetings, people will be confused about things, so then they'll set up more meetings. But
Mhm.
oftentimes I feel like more meetings can just lead to more confusion.
Oh yeah, and I get the connection to the terms too. It's funny. I was like having a discussion with Donald Robertson, who's a Stoic author,
Okay.
and he had started reading the book, and we were kind of going back and forth debating on whether creativity was a virtue and whether we would really admire someone who was creative, uh, even if they used their creativity to find like creative ways to torture kids or something horrible like that. Like, and I sort of concluded, a little ways into this discussion that really we're overcomplicating this with the way we're using language, whether we call
Yeah.
it a virtue or not, or say we admire someone as a whole, or just admire one part of them and not others, right? We're really saying the same thing, and it's based on the same intuitions. We're just using different words for it.
Yes, and it's also like sure, creativity is a virtue when you're using it correctly, I
Right. Well,
guess.
that was his perspective. Mine is that it's a virtue, but if you're not, if you're, demonstrating very low levels of benevolence and love and
Yeah.
humanity, right? Your total virtue could be in the negatives. Even though, like, yeah, I guess it's better to be
Okay,
like
that
a
makes
creative
sense. Yeah.
dictator than a non-creative dictator, right?
Yeah, like creativity is a virtue, but there's other characteristics of yourself that you may have that are very unvirtuous. Is that kind of your
Yeah.
perspective?
That's how I've conceptualized it, but
Yeah.
again, it's all language, right?
Yeah, you get lost in the semantics, and I think that problem is very prevalent when, say, you're talking like different religions communing to each other and like arguing about things. A lot of the times you agree on the same fundamental core principles, but you're getting lost in like um, the very like literal sense of
Hmm.
what the stories are about.
Yeah, I find that and this is one of the things that's led me to conclude that, values are kind of universal, because, Martin Seligman has found that pretty much cross-culturally we see these same, he breaks it down into 24 virtues, but you could split it up any way you wanted to. But basically, we value the same things, and if you study people with very different political views, you actually find they value the same things too, more or less. We just have very different beliefs about what's true, and that affects how our values are sort of manifested.
Yeah, and well, I mean, you can't really. I mean, my opinion on truth is that you can't verify what is or isn't true.
Hmm.
Which is also why I think um, that's why I think virtue is so important because you can kind of conceptualize what virtue is without knowing what is or what isn't true.
Yeah, I mean, this way of thinking about it definitely acknowledges that, like, in some ways there is no self, there is no true you at the core of all this. There's just a conglomerate of perceptions and emotions and desires, and it doesn't argue that you need to actually have a self in
Yeah.
order to pay attention to this construct that is pulling the strings of your well-being, essentially. So I generally share your skepticism about what's true. I think there is some kind of truth, but I also think our brains didn't necessarily evolve to perceive it
Yeah.
clearly, and so we're looking at a potentially very distorted version of objective reality.
So, what do you think is the highest virtue, in your opinion,
So
or is
what
there one?
Nietzsche Yeah, what Nietzsche said is that if you have a virtue and it's your virtue, then it's yours and no one else's. So he basically disagreed with a lot of these, older thinkers like the Stoics, who said, like, there are four cardinal virtues that are above all others. Nietzsche said there is no universal prescription for virtue or morality or whatever. We all are idiosyncratic individuals, and we have to identify our own highest virtues, our own deepest admiration, and find a way to bring that all together and integrate it into our character.
Are you familiar with psychological integration?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, I've it, kind of when you're struggling with like all these different aspects of yourselves and integrating them all into one whole complete person.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that I really struggle with because I feel like, I want so many different things out of life and I feel like I'm so many different people on one person and I just don't know how to kind of integrate those all together. Do you have any insights on that?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's a clear view of reality to think that you're a lot of different drives and people. It's more accurate than to think that you are really just one, and that's
Yep.
very much was Nietzsche's idea. We were a bunch of drives at war with one another, that we kind of simplify and turn into individual people. And a big part of what he argued for was integration. If you look at
Yeah.
what he saw as the ideal person, the Overman or whatever. He was talking about someone who had achieved a level of integration between their drives and their virtues and their and so they've achieved something that ends up looking like a very high degree of self-knowledge and self-mastery, self-control. And so I think a big part of this process is asking these questions and mapping these things out. I mean, when I was a teenager, I created a color-coded mind map of my identity because I was trying to do exactly this thing. I was like, I'm all these different people combined into one. How do I conceptualize them all? And so I had like 8 different categories and all my traits for each of those. And I find that you evolve in this way every few years and kind of need to update a map like this. But a lot of exercises like this can help give you more clarity. There's another one it's been proposed by a thinker called Pennebaker that's basically you create a series of stories about your life. You focus on 5 different aspects of your development and break it down into 5 different periods in your life and the ups and downs of those periods, and kind of creating a story out of all of this can help you better understand and integrate all these different things about you. And then there's also the kind of the Jungian approach of integrating the shadow and coming to terms with your weaknesses and your vices and flaws and properly conceptualizing those along with your strengths and virtues.
And kind of like acknowledging that shadow.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, like living with it, right? And facing it, because it is something very frightening to face your shadow. And this kind of goes back to our topic or our discussion on anxiety, when you need to face those things that you're afraid of.
I think it's scary at first, just like so many other
Yeah.
things are. But once you have confronted it and familiarized yourself with it, it stops being so intimidating, and you get to where you can be kind of comfortable with it and say, like, these are, realities about me. These are who I am right now. It doesn't mean that they have to stay that way, but building that awareness and acceptance of everything about you, I think is important to confront.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to leave off. I really appreciate that you came on. That was a good conversation, and you have lots of good insights, and I'm looking forward to finishing your book.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too. It was a great discussion, and I appreciate you having me. And also, if your listeners want, they can go to designingthemind.org/becoming, and this will give them a couple of free books and also let them know when the new book is out if it isn't already. I got the Book of Self-Mastery and the Psychotext Toolkit that will both get sent to your inbox if you go and join the email list. So, yeah.
All right. Well, you heard him, folks. Just go to his website and pick up a copy of that new book. So it'll be coming out in January, you said?
Probably officially like late February, but it should
Late
be available
February.
for pre-order any day now. So go and pre-order it if you can.
All right. Awesome. See you guys.